The morning air was cold and gray on April 10, 1912, Southampton docks buzzing with a strange mixture of carnival excitement and industrial tension. Above the waterline, champagne corks were already being loosened. Below it, in the steel belly of the RMS Titanic, 600 men and women were descending into a labyrinth most passengers would never see. They carried battered suitcases, wore clothes that smelled of coal smoke and lye soap, and spoke in accents from Belfast, Liverpool, London's East End, and the rural counties where work had dried up like old bread. They were stewards, stewardesses, engineers, firemen, trimmers, greasers, scullery maids, bellboys, and countless others whose names would be recorded in the ship's manifest but rarely spoken aloud in the dining saloons above. They were the invisible architecture of luxury, the human machinery that would make the Titanic glide like a palace through the Atlantic, and they were about to enter a world designed to keep them both essential and unseen. The Titanic was not merely a ship. It was a floating microcosm of Edwardian class structure, a three-dimensional blueprint of who mattered and who did not, built into every rivet and deck plate. White Star Line had invested approximately $7.5 million into her construction, equivalent to roughly $210 million today when adjusted for inflation. That staggering capital allocation was not spent equally. The first-class accommodations featured Turkish baths, a swimming pool, a squash court, and staterooms paneled in mahogany and rosewood. Second class enjoyed amenities that would have been considered first class on most other vessels. Third class, or steerage, was utilitarian but relatively clean by the standards of 1912. But there was a fourth world aboard the Titanic, a shadow realm that existed in the mechanical intestines of the ship, a network of cramped passageways, narrow staircases, and berthing areas where the crew lived in conditions that would have horrified even the third-class passengers who slept 6 decks above them. These were not the tunnels of myth or conspiracy. They were real, documented spaces, engineered with ruthless efficiency to move labor through the ship without disturbing the guests. The crew corridors, known colloquially as the working alleyways or Scotland Road after the infamous Liverpool Street, ran nearly the entire length of E-deck, a central artery that allowed stewards, bellboys, and kitchen staff to traverse the ship quickly and invisibly. From this main corridor branched dozens of smaller passages, ladderways, and service staircases that connected to galleys, pantries, linen stores, and the crew quarters themselves. It was a city beneath a city, a parallel civilization that operated on different rules, different schedules, and a different understanding of survival. The scale of the operation was staggering. To serve approximately 700 first-class passengers, 300 second-class, and over 700 third-class, the Titanic employed a workforce that outnumbered the first-class passengers nearly 2 to 1. This was not accidental. Luxury, particularly Edwardian luxury, was labor-intensive. Every meal required not just cooks and sous chefs but also scullery maids to scrub pots, still-room workers to prepare tea and coffee, plate stewards to carry courses, and sommeliers to manage wine service. Every stateroom required chambermaids to turn down beds, valets to press clothing, and stewards to respond to call bells at any hour. The Titanic's operating costs in labor alone exceeded $15,000 per voyage, a sum that reflected both the sheer number of workers and the grueling hours they were expected to maintain. If you value stories that excavate what's been buried, that refuse to look away from the people history tried to erase, then staying means something. These aren't easy narratives. They're the ones that require patience, and your presence here signals that patience still exists. The crew berthing areas were located on the lower decks, primarily on E and F decks, far from the opulence above. Male crew members were housed in cramped dormitories, often sleeping in bunk beds stacked 3 high, with barely 2 feet of clearance between each tier. Privacy was non-existent. Lockers were shared. Ventilation was poor, and the air carried the perpetual smell of coal dust, sweat, and damp wool. Female crew members, primarily stewardesses and galley workers, were housed in slightly better but still austere conditions, their quarters separated by a locked gate that was monitored to enforce strict moral codes. The White Star Line, like all shipping companies of the era, operated under the assumption that crew comfort was a luxury the company could not afford. Profit margins in transatlantic shipping were thin despite the grandeur, and every square foot devoted to crew comfort was a square foot that could have been sold to a paying passenger. The working alleyways themselves were narrow, often less than 4 feet wide, lit by dim electric bulbs that cast long shadows and made navigation disorienting for newcomers. The floors were steel, painted a dull gray, and they echoed with footsteps at all hours. There were no windows. No natural light. The only way to know whether it was day or night was to climb to the upper decks, which many crew members did not have time to do during their shifts. A typical steward worked between 16 and 18 hours per day, with breaks taken in hurried gulps of tea and stale bread in the crew mess. Stewardesses fared no better, responsible for cleaning cabins, laundering linens, and attending to the personal needs of passengers who often treated them as animate furniture. The wages for this labor ranged from £3.15 per month for an assistant steward to about £4.10 for a stewardess, equivalent to roughly $500 to $600 per month in today's currency. Adjusted for purchasing power and inflation, this was subsistence income, enough to survive but never enough to save. Yet many of these workers were not aboard the Titanic because they loved the sea or sought adventure. They were there because the British economy in 1912 was in a slow, grinding contraction. Unemployment hovered near 6%, higher in industrial towns where factories were closing and dockyards were laying off workers by the hundreds. For a young man from Belfast or a widow from Southampton, a position aboard the Titanic represented rare security, a paycheck that arrived with mechanical regularity even if the work was brutal. The White Star Line understood this desperation and exploited it with surgical precision. Contracts were structured to favor the company at every turn. Crew members were not paid during the voyage itself, only upon arrival in New York, which meant that if a worker fell ill or was dismissed mid-voyage, they received nothing. If the ship sank, payment stopped the moment the vessel went under. This clause, buried in the fine print of employment agreements, would become one of the cruelest ironies of the Titanic disaster. The labor aboard the Titanic was divided into rigid hierarchies, each with its own uniform, its own privileges, and its own access to the ship's geography. At the top of the crew hierarchy were the officers, the ship's surgeon, the chief purser, and the senior engineering staff. These men dined in the officers' mess, had private cabins, and moved through the first-class areas with a degree of authority. Below them were the bedroom stewards and dining saloon stewards who worked directly with first-class passengers. These men wore crisp white jackets, learned the names and preferences of their assigned guests, and were expected to be invisible until needed and effusively helpful when summoned. They occupied a strange middle ground, neither servants nor gentlemen, granted proximity to wealth but never inclusion within it. Further down the hierarchy were the general stewards, bellboys, and lift operators, young men often in their teens who ran errands, carried luggage, and operated the ship's 3 electric elevators. These boys earned even less than the adult stewards, sometimes as little as £2 per month, but the work was seen as a stepping stone, a way to gain experience in the hospitality industry and perhaps one day move into a better position on a larger ship or in a grand hotel. Many of them came from impoverished backgrounds, orphanages, or broken homes, and they sent a portion of their meager earnings back to mothers or siblings who depended on that income. The bellboys slept in shared quarters near the crew galley, a space so small that beds had to be rotated in shifts, with boys sleeping in bunks still warm from the previous occupant. Then there were the engineers, firemen, and trimmers, the men who worked in the bowels of the ship, in the boiler rooms and engine rooms where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These men, numbering over 250, were the literal engines of the Titanic's speed and power. They shoveled coal into furnaces that consumed over 600 tons of fuel per day, their bodies caked in black dust, their lungs slowly filling with particulate matter that would shorten their lives whether the ship sank or not. The firemen and trimmers worked in 4-hour shifts, a schedule designed to prevent collapse from heat exhaustion, but even 4 hours in those conditions was a descent into a kind of industrial hell. The coal bunkers, located adjacent to the boiler rooms, were connected by narrow passages that required men to crawl on hands and knees, dragging sacks of coal behind them. Ventilation was minimal. The air was thick with smoke and steam. Men fainted regularly, and when they did, they were dragged out by their comrades and revived with cold water before being sent back in. These men were paid slightly better than the stewards, reflecting the danger and difficulty of their work. A fireman earned about £6 per month, roughly $750 in modern terms, but this wage came with an understanding that injury was not a matter of if but when. Burns were common. Crushed fingers and broken bones were routine. The White Star Line provided no workers' compensation, no health insurance, and no disability pay. If a man was injured too severely to work, he was dismissed at the next port, left to fend for himself in a foreign city with no resources and no recourse. This brutal calculus of labor exploitation was standard practice across the shipping industry, a system that treated human beings as disposable components in a vast profit-generating machine. The scullery maids, the lowest tier of the labor hierarchy, worked in conditions that would be illegal in most developed nations today. These women, many of them Irish or English girls in their teens, were responsible for washing the mountains of dishes, pots, and silverware generated by the first-class dining saloon. They stood for 12 to 14 hours per day in cramped, poorly ventilated galleys, their hands raw from lye soap and scalding water. They earned about £3 per month, less than half of what a fireman made, and they slept in dormitories that were little more than storage closets with beds. The galleys themselves were located on D deck, directly below the first-class dining saloon, connected by a system of dumbwaiters and service staircases that allowed food to be sent up and dirty dishes to be sent down in a continuous, exhausting cycle. The scullery maids rarely saw daylight. They worked in the artificial glow of electric lamps, their world reduced to the clang of metal, the hiss of steam, and the relentless, mind-numbing repetition of scrubbing and rinsing. Before we move further into the machinery of this hidden world, consider what it means to be essential and invisible at once. If that paradox resonates with you, if it makes you think of people in your own life who keep systems running while being overlooked, then leave that thought below. These conversations matter because they remind us what we're willing to forget. What made the Titanic's below-deck world particularly insidious was not just the poor conditions but the deliberate architectural design that enforced separation and control. The ship was built with a clear understanding that crew and passengers must occupy the same physical space but never the same social space. The working alleyways were not merely functional, they were ideological. They allowed the machinery of service to operate without the mess of humanity being visible. A first-class passenger could dine on oysters and champagne, retire to a stateroom where the bed had been turned down and the pillows fluffed, and never once see the chambermaid who had done the work. The maid had entered through a service door, moved through the crew corridors, completed her tasks, and exited the same way, a ghost in the machine of comfort. This invisibility was maintained through strict rules and severe penalties. Crew members were forbidden from using passenger staircases unless explicitly ordered to do so. They could not speak to passengers unless spoken to first. They could not linger in passenger areas, could not make eye contact, could not express opinions or emotions that might disrupt the fantasy of effortless service. Violations of these rules resulted in immediate dismissal, and in an industry where reputation was everything, being fired from a White Star Line vessel meant difficulty finding work elsewhere. The shipping companies maintained informal blacklists, shared among themselves, ensuring that troublemakers, union organizers, or anyone who challenged the system would be permanently excluded from employment. Yet despite these oppressive conditions, or perhaps because of them, a unique culture developed among the crew. Bonds formed in the shared misery of 16-hour shifts, in the dark, cramped quarters where men and women slept inches apart from one another. Nicknames were given. Songs were sung in the crew mess. Small acts of kindness, a shared cigarette, a whispered joke, an extra piece of bread slipped to someone who had missed a meal, became the currency of solidarity. The crew of the Titanic were not a monolithic group. They came from different cities, different backgrounds, different levels of skill and education. But they shared a common understanding that they were expendable, that their labor was valued only insofar as it served the comfort of those above, and that their survival depended on looking out for one another. Among the 600 crew members, certain individuals stand out, not because they were famous, but because their stories illuminate the broader tragedy. There was Violet Jessop, a stewardess who had already survived the collision of the RMS Olympic the previous year and would go on to survive the sinking of the HMHS Britannic 4 years later, earning her the nickname Miss Unsinkable. Violet was 24 years old in 1912, the daughter of Irish immigrants, and she had entered service work to support her family after her father's death. She worked in the first-class cabins, attending to wealthy women who often treated her with casual cruelty, but she maintained a quiet dignity, a refusal to be diminished by the work. Her memoir, written decades later, provides one of the few first-hand accounts of what life was like for the female crew, the constant exhaustion, the sexual harassment from male passengers and officers, the fear of being dismissed without pay. There was also Frederick Fleet, the lookout in the crow's nest who would spot the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14. Fleet was 24 years old, an orphan who had grown up in a Dr. Barnardo's home, one of the charitable institutions that took in destitute children in Victorian England. He had gone to sea at 15, worked his way up from cabin boy to able seaman, and by 1912 had earned a position as lookout, a job that required sharp eyes and steady nerves. Fleet earned £5 per month, slightly more than a steward, and he slept in a shared cabin on E deck, far below the bridge where the officers stood. On the night of the sinking, Fleet would ring the warning bell 3 times and telephone the bridge with the now famous words, "Iceberg, right ahead." His warning came too late. The ship's momentum, her size, and the physics of inertia made collision inevitable. Fleet would survive the sinking, but he would spend the rest of his life haunted by guilt, by the belief that if he had been given binoculars, if the night had not been so dark, if he had seen the iceberg just 30 seconds earlier, the disaster might have been avoided. Then there was Charles Juffin, the chief baker, a man whose story would become one of the most bizarre and improbable survival tales of the disaster. Juffin was 33 years old, a career baker who had worked on passenger liners for over a decade. He supervised a team of 13 bakers who worked through the night, preparing bread, pastries, and desserts for the following day's meals. On the night of the sinking, Juffin fortified himself with whiskey, drinking heavily as the ship began to list. The alcohol, rather than impairing him, may have saved his life. When the Titanic went under, Juffin rowed the stern down into the water, stepped off calmly as if disembarking a pier, and then spent over 2 hours treading water in the freezing Atlantic. The whiskey dilated his blood vessels, delaying the onset of hypothermia long enough for him to be pulled onto an overturned lifeboat. He survived with barely a scratch, a statistical anomaly in a disaster that killed 1,500 people. But for every Violet Jessop, every Frederick Fleet, every Charles Juffin who survived, there were dozens of crew members whose names are known only because they appear on the casualty lists. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, died in the sinking, but his death is remembered because of his status. The deaths of fireman John Priest, trimmer Thomas Patrick Dillon, scullery maid Annie Robinson, and bedroom steward James Witter are footnotes, their lives reduced to a name, an age, and a job title. They had families, dreams, debts, and responsibilities, but those details did not make it into the historical record because history has never been particularly interested in the lives of the poor. The financial mechanics of how the White Star Line managed its labor force reveal a system designed to maximize profit extraction while minimizing liability. Crew members were classified as independent contractors rather than employees, a legal fiction that absolved the company of responsibility for workplace injuries, illness, or death. This meant that when the Titanic sank, the families of the crew who perished received no compensation from the White Star Line. Some received small payouts from relief funds established by charities and newspapers, but these were voluntary donations, not legal obligations. The company's position was clear: the crew had accepted the risks of maritime employment, and their deaths, while regrettable, were not the company's financial responsibility. This logic, cold and brutal, was entirely consistent with the laissez-faire capitalism of the early 20th century, a system that treated labor as a commodity to be purchased at the lowest possible price and discarded when it was no longer useful. The operating costs of the Titanic, adjusted for inflation, provide a stark contrast to the wages paid to the crew. The ship burned approximately 650 tons of coal per day at a cost of roughly $3 per ton in 1912, or about $85 per ton today. That meant daily fuel costs alone exceeded $55,000, over $1.5 million per month. Yet the total payroll for the entire crew, 600 people working brutal hours in dangerous conditions, was less than £4,000 per month, equivalent to about $500,000 today. This means that the Titanic's fuel costs exceeded its labor costs by a factor of 3 to 1, a disparity that reveals exactly how the White Star Line valued its human workers compared to its coal supply. If this calculus makes you uneasy, if the arithmetic of exploitation laid bare feels like something worth acknowledging, then a simple gesture of recognition matters. Not as applause, but as a signal that you see what's being shown. That seeing, that refusal to look away, is the first act of witness. The design of the crew areas was not merely utilitarian but deliberately punitive, a physical manifestation of the company's contempt for the people who made luxury possible. The berthing areas lacked adequate heating, even though the ship was crossing the North Atlantic in April when nighttime temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. Crew members slept under thin wool blankets, often wearing their clothes to bed for warmth. The toilets and washrooms were communal, with one toilet for every 20 to 30 crew members, and the water was unheated. Bathing was a luxury that most crew members could not afford the time or energy for, leading to widespread issues with lice, skin infections, and other hygiene-related illnesses. The ship's surgeon, Dr. William O'Loughlin, maintained a small infirmary for passengers but had minimal resources for treating crew members, who were expected to work through illness unless they were literally unable to stand. The food provided to the crew was markedly inferior to what was served in the passenger dining saloons. While first-class passengers enjoyed 11-course meals featuring caviar, foie gras, and roasted squab. The crew mess served boiled potatoes, salt pork, and stale bread. The meals were prepared in bulk, often hours before they were eaten, and by the time they reached the crew, they were cold and congealed. Tea was the primary beverage, weak and bitter, rationed carefully to ensure that costs remained low. Many crew members supplemented their diet by stealing food from the passenger galleys, a risky practice that could result in immediate dismissal but was so widespread that officers largely turned a blind eye. The theft was tacitly understood as part of the compensation package, an unspoken acknowledgement that the official rations were insufficient to sustain the physical demands of the work. The psychological toll of this existence is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Living in constant proximity to opulence while being denied even basic comfort creates a cognitive dissonance that erodes the soul. Stewards served meals that cost more than their monthly wages. Chambermaids cleaned staterooms larger than the homes they had left behind. Bellboys carried luggage for passengers who tipped them more in a single afternoon than they earned in a week, but those tips were often confiscated by senior stewards or pursers who claimed the right to redistribute them according to a hierarchy that favored those already in positions of relative power. The emotional labor required to smile, to bow, to express gratitude for the opportunity to serve, while being treated as subhuman, cultivated a deep, corrosive resentment that could not be openly expressed but simmered beneath the surface. Yet there were moments of resistance, small acts of defiance that punctured the illusion of total control. Stewards would deliberately slow their service to passengers they found particularly rude. Firemen would stage informal slowdowns, letting the boilers cool slightly to force a reduction in speed, a symbolic assertion that they, not the officers, controlled the ship's power. Scullery maids would accidentally break expensive china, a small act of vandalism that could be blamed on the chaos of the galley. These acts were rarely coordinated, never rising to the level of organized labor action, but they were expressions of agency, reminders that even in a system designed to strip people of autonomy, the human spirit finds ways to assert itself. The sexual politics aboard the Titanic were particularly brutal for female crew members. Stewardesses were subject to harassment from male passengers, officers, and fellow crew members, and there was no formal mechanism for reporting or addressing this abuse. A woman who complained risked being labeled a troublemaker, which could lead to dismissal. The locked gates separating male and female crew quarters were ostensibly to protect women's virtue, but they also functioned as a form of control, restricting women's movement and reinforcing the idea that their bodies were property to be guarded. Pregnancies did occur, despite the strict separation, and when they did, the woman was immediately dismissed without pay or reference, left to face the social stigma of unwed motherhood in an era when such circumstances could mean destitution. The children aboard the Titanic, both as passengers and as crew, add another layer of tragedy to the story. Several bellboys were as young as 14, and while they were technically employed, they were also children, thrust into adult responsibilities with no protection or support. These boys had often been recruited from workhouses or orphanages, their labor sold to the White Star Line by institutions that saw shipping companies as a convenient way to offload the expense of caring for destitute youth. The boys were given uniforms, a bunk, and a wage, but they were also given 16-hour shifts, exposure to adult vices, and a level of responsibility that would break many adults. When the Titanic sank, several of these boys died, their bodies never recovered, their deaths marked only by a line in a ledger and a brief mention in a newspaper. The disaster itself, when it came, exposed the full cruelty of the ship's design and the company's priorities. When the iceberg struck at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, the initial damage was not immediately apparent to most of the crew. The collision was felt as a shudder, a grinding scrape along the starboard side, but in the crew quarters on E and F decks, many workers assumed it was a minor incident, perhaps a dropped anchor or a mechanical issue. It was not until water began flooding into the mail room and the squash court that the severity of the situation became clear. The watertight doors, which were supposed to seal off damaged compartments and prevent flooding, closed automatically, but they also trapped dozens of crew members in the lower decks. Men who had been working in the boiler rooms, in the cargo holds, in the mail sorting room, found themselves cut off from the escape routes, forced to navigate unfamiliar passageways in the dark as the water rose around them. The lifeboats, the ultimate symbol of the disaster's inequities, were loaded according to a strict hierarchy that prioritized first-class passengers, then women and children from second and third class, and finally crew members if space remained. This protocol, enforced by officers at gunpoint in some cases, meant that many crew members who had spent their entire careers at sea, who knew how to row and navigate, were left aboard a sinking ship while lifeboats launched half-empty because first-class men refused to board alongside steerage passengers. The mathematics of the lifeboat capacity reveal the callousness of the ship's design. The Titanic carried lifeboats for approximately 1,178 people, less than half of the total number of passengers and crew aboard. This was legal, compliant with outdated Board of Trade regulations that calculated lifeboat requirements based on tonnage rather than human capacity, but it was also a deliberate cost-saving measure. Lifeboats took up valuable deck space that could be used for promenades and leisure areas that attracted wealthy passengers. The decision to prioritize aesthetics and passenger comfort over safety was made in boardrooms in London, by men who would never set foot on the Titanic, and it was the crew and third-class passengers who paid the price. As the ship began its final plunge, the crew corridors became death traps. The narrow passageways, which had been designed for efficiency, became choke points where dozens of people struggled to reach the staircases leading to the upper decks. The electric lights, powered by the ship's generators, remained on for most of the sinking, casting a surreal glow over scenes of chaos and terror. Stewards and stewardesses, who had spent the voyage attending to passenger needs, now found themselves trapped below deck, pounding on locked gates and watertight doors that had been sealed to slow the flooding but also prevented escape. The Scotland Road, the main crew corridor on E-deck, filled with water rapidly as the bow dipped lower. Men and women clawed at each other in the darkness, desperate to reach the ladderways and staircases that led to the boat deck. The engineering crew, the firemen and trimmers who had worked in the boiler rooms, faced an impossible choice. They could abandon their posts and attempt to reach the lifeboats, or they could remain at their stations, keeping the pumps running and the lights burning for as long as possible to give others a chance to escape. The majority chose to stay. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his team of 35 engineers remained in the engine rooms, maintaining power to the very end, knowing that their decision was a death sentence. Their sacrifice bought time, kept the lights on so that lifeboats could be loaded, kept the distress calls transmitting so that rescue ships could be summoned, but it was a sacrifice demanded by a system that valued their labor more than their lives. Not one member of the engineering crew survived. If you're still here, still absorbing the weight of these choices, then you understand that this is not entertainment. This is archaeology of conscience. And if these stories deserve to continue being told, then your presence here, your willingness to support this kind of work, is what makes it possible. The final moments of the Titanic are well documented in the testimonies of survivors, but what is less discussed is what those final moments were like for the crew members trapped below. As the ship's stern rose out of the water, the crew quarters tilted at impossible angles. Furniture slid across floors. Water surged through open doorways and portholes. The sound, survivors would later report, was apocalyptic, a combination of screaming metal, rushing water, and human voices crying out in dozens of languages. Some crew members made it to the upper decks only to find all the lifeboats gone. Others drowned in their bunks, too exhausted from their shifts to wake in time. Still others were crushed when the ship broke apart, the immense structural failure splitting the vessel in two and sending debris raining down on anyone in the water. The survival rates tell the story with brutal clarity. Of the 685 crew members aboard the Titanic, 212 survived, a survival rate of roughly 31%. Compare this to the first-class passengers, who had a survival rate of 62%, or even third-class passengers, who survived at a rate of 25%. The crew, despite their knowledge of the ship, despite their experience at sea, died at a higher rate than second-class passengers and nearly as high a rate as the poorest steerage passengers. This was not random. It was structural. The crew quarters were located in the most vulnerable parts of the ship, the areas that flooded first. The crew had the least access to lifeboats. And perhaps most importantly, the crew were expected to prioritize passenger safety over their own survival, an expectation enforced by a culture of service that made self-preservation seem like betrayal. Among the dead were 146 of the 250 engineering crew, 67 of the 78 firemen and trimmers, 18 of the 20 scullery and galley workers, and 23 of the 89 stewards. The list of names reads like a census of working-class Britain, surnames that reflect Irish, Scottish, and English heritage, ages ranging from 14 to 67. They were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Some had families waiting for them in Southampton, families who would receive a telegram days later informing them that wages had been terminated as of April 15, 1912, at 2:20 a.m., the moment the ship sank. The White Star Line's payroll clerks were efficient in their cruelty. The aftermath of the disaster saw a flurry of inquiries, investigations, and public outrage, but very little of it focused on the crew. The American inquiry, led by Senator William Alden Smith, and the British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, were primarily concerned with questions of navigation, lifeboat capacity, and whether the nearby ship, the SS Californian, could have prevented loss of life by responding to distress rockets. The working conditions of the crew, the structural inequities that made their deaths more likely, the fact that they were paid poverty wages to work in dangerous conditions without any safety net, these issues were barely mentioned. When they were raised, they were dismissed as irrelevant to the central questions of maritime safety. The inquiries resulted in new regulations requiring ships to carry sufficient lifeboats for all passengers and crew, a reform that came too late for the 1,500 people who died but would save countless lives in the decades to come. What the inquiries did not address, and what has largely been ignored by popular retellings of the Titanic story, is the economic system that made the disaster possible. The White Star Line was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, an American trust controlled by financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan had consolidated several shipping lines into a monopoly designed to dominate transatlantic passenger traffic and maximize profits. This pursuit of profit required cutting costs wherever possible, which meant minimizing labor expenses, skimping on safety features, and pushing ships to operate at maximum capacity with minimum redundancy. The Titanic was a product of this logic, a floating monument to the idea that efficiency and luxury could coexist without consequence. The disaster proved otherwise, but the lesson was quickly forgotten. The survivors of the crew faced a harsh and unforgiving world upon their return. Many were haunted by survivors' guilt, by the memory of colleagues and friends left behind. Some, like Frederick Fleet, struggled with alcoholism and depression, unable to reconcile the trauma of the sinking with the banality of everyday life. Violet Jessop returned to work on passenger liners, driven by economic necessity, and survived 2 more maritime disasters before finally retiring. Charles Juffin emigrated to the United States, where he worked as a baker in New Jersey, rarely speaking about the sinking. For these survivors, the Titanic was not a distant historical event but a lived experience that shaped every day of their remaining lives. The families of the dead crew members faced destitution. The relief funds established in the wake of the disaster provided some assistance, but it was inadequate and unevenly distributed. The Titanic Relief Fund, which raised over £400,000, equivalent to roughly $50 million today, prioritized widows and orphans of passengers over crew families, reflecting the same class hierarchies that had governed life aboard the ship. A widow of a first-class passenger might receive a pension sufficient to maintain a middle-class lifestyle, while the widow of a fireman received a one-time payment that barely covered funeral expenses. Many crew widows were forced into workhouses, the Victorian institutions for the destitute, where they labored in conditions not unlike those their husbands had endured aboard the Titanic. The physical remnants of the crew areas of the Titanic lie today at the bottom of the North Atlantic, 2.5 miles below the surface, slowly being consumed by bacteria and the corrosive effects of salt water. When Robert Ballard discovered the wreck in 1985, his team used remotely operated vehicles to explore the interior, capturing haunting images of the ship's decayed remains. The crew corridors, the Scotland Road, the berthing areas, all are now collapsed and encrusted with rusticles, the formations of rust and bacteria that hang from every surface like frozen tears. The objects found in the debris field, boots, belt buckles, serving trays, tell the story of the people who worked there, but they are silent witnesses, incapable of conveying the full weight of the lives they represent. In the decades since the sinking, the Titanic has been transformed into myth, a story told and retold in films, books, and documentaries. James Cameron's 1997 film brought the disaster to a global audience, introducing Jack and Rose, fictional characters whose romance captured the popular imagination. The film was meticulous in its recreation of the ship's design and the sequence of the sinking, but it largely sidelined the crew, reducing them to background figures whose labor and deaths were incidental to the central love story. This erasure is not unique to Cameron's film. It is endemic to how the Titanic is remembered. The focus is always on the passengers, particularly the wealthy passengers, whose stories are seen as more dramatic, more worthy of attention. The crew, the 600 people who made the voyage possible, remain largely invisible, just as they were designed to be. But invisibility is not the same as non-existence. The crew of the Titanic were real people with real lives, and their stories matter because they reveal uncomfortable truths about the systems we live within. The same logic that placed 600 workers in the bowels of a ship, paid them starvation wages, and then denied them lifeboats when the ship sank, is the same logic that governs much of our economy today. Workers are still treated as expendable. Profit is still prioritized over safety. The gap between the wealthy and the working class is still enforced through architecture, policy, and violence. The Titanic is not an aberration. It is a blueprint. The psychological dimension of the disaster extends beyond the immediate trauma of the sinking. For the crew who survived, there was the burden of guilt, the question of why they lived when so many others died. For the families left behind, there was the burden of grief compounded by financial ruin. And for society at large, there was the burden of collective amnesia, the choice to remember the Titanic as a tragic accident rather than a preventable consequence of systemic exploitation. This amnesia serves a function. It allows us to consume the story as entertainment, to be moved by the spectacle of the sinking without confronting the economic and political structures that made it possible. The workers' tunnels of the Titanic were not unique to that ship. Every passenger liner of the era, and many of the luxury hotels and mansions of the Gilded Age, were built with similar hidden spaces, places where the labor that sustained luxury could be performed out of sight. The servants' quarters of grand estates were deliberately placed in basements or attic spaces, accessible only by narrow back staircases. The kitchens of luxury hotels were hidden behind walls and service doors, their noise and heat banished from the dining rooms where guests enjoyed their meals. This architectural segregation was not incidental. It was essential to maintaining the illusion that luxury was effortless, that wealth did not require the exploitation of others. Before this ends, ask yourself what stories you're willing to carry forward. Not the comfortable ones, but the ones that ask something of you. If that question has lodged itself somewhere inside you, then say so. Because these stories live only as long as people refuse to let them disappear. The Titanic disaster did lead to some reforms in maritime safety and labor practices, but these reforms were limited in scope and often poorly enforced. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, adopted in 1914, mandated sufficient lifeboats, regular lifeboat drills, and continuous radio watch, but it did not address the underlying issues of crew working conditions, wages, or labor rights. The shipping industry continued to operate with minimal oversight, and disasters continued to occur. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, the Empress of Ireland in 1914, and countless smaller tragedies, all involved significant loss of crew life, and in each case, the crew were the last to be considered in both the disaster response and the subsequent inquiries. It was not until the mid-20th century, with the rise of labor unions and the expansion of workers' rights, that conditions began to improve significantly. The National Maritime Union, founded in 1937, fought for better wages, safer working conditions, and compensation for workplace injuries. These victories were hard-won, often achieved through strikes and protests that put workers at risk of losing their livelihoods. The lessons of the Titanic, the understanding that workers deserved dignity and protection, were not learned easily or quickly. They had to be extracted, painfully, from a system that resisted every step of the way. Today, the crew quarters of modern cruise ships are vastly superior to those of the Titanic, but they still reflect a hierarchical structure that places workers in less desirable accommodations while passengers enjoy luxury. Crew members on contemporary cruise ships often live in small cabins below the waterline, work long shifts with limited days off, and are paid wages that, while better than in 1912, are still low relative to the profits generated by the cruise industry. Many crew members come from developing nations, recruited by agencies that charge fees for placement, a system that creates debt bondage and limits workers' ability to leave if conditions are poor. The ghosts of the Titanic's crew, the men and women who died in service to a system that valued their labor but not their lives, linger in these modern arrangements. The legacy of the Titanic is complex and contested. For some, it is a story of human hubris, a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence in technology. For others, it is a love story, a tale of romance and sacrifice. But for those willing to look beyond the surface, it is a story about class, about labor, about the invisible people who make the world work and the systems that exploit and discard them. The 600 crew members who boarded the Titanic in Southampton were not incidental to the disaster. They were central to it. Their labor made the voyage possible. Their deaths were not accidents. They were the predictable outcome of a system that treated human beings as costs to be minimized rather than lives to be valued. The secret of the Titanic's servants' tunnels is not that they existed. It is that they were necessary, that luxury could not function without them, and that the people who moved through them were designed to be forgotten. But they cannot be forgotten, not if we are honest about history, not if we are serious about building a more just world. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their stories deserve to be told. And their deaths demand that we ask difficult questions about the systems we continue to tolerate, the hierarchies we continue to enforce, and the people we continue to render invisible in the pursuit of comfort and profit. The tunnels are gone now, collapsed into the mud of the Atlantic floor, but the logic that created them persists. Every time we enjoy a luxury without thinking about the hands that made it possible, every time we benefit from a system without asking who it exploits, we are walking through those tunnels, blind to the human cost beneath our feet. The Titanic asks us to see. It asks us to remember. It asks us to reckon with the truth that convenience and cruelty are often two sides of the same coin. And so we return to that morning in Southampton, to the 600 men and women descending into the ship's belly, carrying their battered suitcases and their fragile hopes. They believed they were embarking on a routine voyage, a few weeks of grueling work followed by a paycheck and a brief respite before the next ship, the next shift, the next sacrifice. They could not have known that they were walking into history, that their lives and deaths would become a cautionary tale told and retold across generations. But perhaps, if they could speak to us now, they would not want to be cautionary tales. Perhaps they would simply want to be seen, to be remembered not as statistics or symbols but as people who worked, who loved, who hoped, and who deserved better than the world gave them. Their tunnels may be gone, but their story endures. It endures in every worker who is told to be grateful for exploitation. It endures in every system that hides the cost of luxury. It endures in every choice we make about whose lives matter and whose do not. The Titanic did not sink because of an iceberg. It sank because a system valued profit over people, speed over safety, and appearances over truth. That system did not die with the ship. It is still here, still operating, still demanding that some people remain invisible so that others can live in comfort. The question is not whether we can see the tunnels. The question is whether we have the courage to dismantle them. If you've reached this point, if you've carried these 600 names and their unspoken burdens this far, then this is not passive consumption. This is an act of remembering. And if remembering means something to you, if it means enough to ensure this work continues, then your choice to stay, to share, to speak of what you've witnessed here, becomes part of the story itself. Not the end, but the continuation.